Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're diving into the work of a thinker who, well, he really challenges us to rethink some fundamental ideas about freedom and how society should work. We're talking about Murray Rothbard and his book, The Ethics of Liberty.
Definitely a challenging one. Rothbard is known for his hardcore libertarian views, and he really doesn't shy away from pushing the envelope, even when it comes to topics that make a lot of people uncomfortable.
And we're going to get into some of those potentially uncomfortable topics for sure. But let's start with something that sounds pretty basic. Self-ownership. What exactly does Rothbard mean by that?
It might seem simple on the surface, but it has huge implications. It's the idea that each of us has an absolute right to our own body, our own labor, and what we produce with that labor.
Okay, so it's like, I own myself, and no one else has the right to tell me what to do with my life, my time, my skills.
Exactly. You are your own person, and you have the right to make choices about your own life without interference from others, as long as you're not infringing on their right to do the same.
So if I bake a cake, that cake is mine because I made it, and no one can just come and take it without my permission.
You got it. Rothbard argues that when you mix your labor with something, like ingredients to make a cake, you create a property right in that thing. It's an extension of your self-ownership.
So even something as simple as baking a cake has profound implications for how we understand property and ownership.
Absolutely. And Rothbard takes this idea even further with his famous Crusoe economics example, where he imagines someone stranded on a deserted island.
Right, I remember that one. It's like even if you're all alone, the principles of self-ownership and property still apply.
Exactly. If you find a coconut tree and put in the effort to gather coconuts, those coconuts are yours. Someone else can't just come along and claim them just because they saw them first. You put in the work, so they're yours.
It's about effort, about adding value, not just stumbling upon something. Makes sense to me. But what happens when we move beyond that deserted island scenario? How does Rothbard's view of property play out in a more complex society where people can acquire wealth not just by producing things, but also by, well, taking things from others?
That's where his concept of plunder comes in. Rothbard sees plunder as the opposite of production. It's about trying to get ahead by taking what others have created through their own effort.
So stealing would be a pretty clear example of plunder, right?
Definitely. Theft is a direct violation of someone's property rights. But Rothbard includes things like slavery and fraud under this umbrella of plunder as well.
Because they all involve taking something that doesn't belong to you, violating someone else's self-ownership in the process.
Exactly. Enslaving someone is literally treating a human being as property, and fraud is tricking someone into giving up their property through deception.
So Rothbard would argue that societies that allow plunder, whether it's through outright theft, slavery, or fraud, are undermining the very foundation of a just and prosperous society.
Exactly. He believes that plunder leads to conflict, instability, and ultimately less prosperity for everyone because it disincentivizes people from producing and innovating. Why bother creating something if someone can just come along and take it?
So if plunder is the problem, what's the solution? How do we establish rightful ownership in a way that respects individual rights? I know Rothbard talks a lot about homesteading. How does that fit into all of this?
Homesteading is a key concept for Rothbard when it comes to understanding how property rights are initially established. He argues that if you're the first to find and use a piece of unowned land, say by cultivating it, building on it, you're mixing your labor with it and transforming it, and that's what gives you a rightful claim to it.
So it's like putting your stamp on it, not through force or conquest, but through productive effort. You're making something new, something useful, and the act itself establishes your ownership.
You got it. And this principle of homesteading isn't limited to land either. Rothbard extends it to other resources, even ideas.
So if I invent a new gadget or write a hit song, that's mine. And someone can't just come along and claim it as their own.
Right. Rothbard would argue that you have a property right in that creation because you brought it into being through your effort and creativity.
It all comes back to that self-ownership thing, doesn't it? Your creations are an extension of yourself, of your effort, and your unique perspective.
Exactly. And for Rothbard, this all ties into his view of how people should interact in a free society, which he believes should be based on the principle of voluntary exchange.
Okay, so break that down for me. How does voluntary exchange flow from all of this talk about self-ownership and property rights?
It's about recognizing that every individual has a right to their own life, their own labor, and their own property, and therefore any interaction between individuals should be based on mutual consent, not force or coercion.
So I can't just force someone to share their invention with me no matter how much I might want it. I have to convince them, maybe offer them something they value in return.
Precisely. And that's the beauty of voluntary exchange. It allows individuals to specialize in what they're good at, produce goods and services, and then trade with each other in a way that benefits everyone involved.
It's like this beautiful dance of cooperation that emerges when we respect each other's rights and freedoms.
Exactly. But of course, we don't live in a perfect world. So what happens when someone decides they don't want to play by the rules of voluntary exchange? What happens when someone decides to take what they want through force or deception? That's where Rothbard's views on aggression and punishment come in.
And I'm guessing he doesn't just mean physical violence when he talks about aggression.
You're right. He defines aggression very broadly as any violation of those fundamental property rights we've been discussing. So obviously, things like assault, murder, theft, those all fall under the umbrella of aggression.
Because they all involve violating someone's right to their own body, their own life, their own property.
Exactly. But Rothbard goes even further. He argues that even things like fraud, where you're tricking someone into giving up their property through deception, are a form of aggression.
Because you're still violating their property rights, even if you're not using physical force. You're manipulating them, taking advantage of them, and that's not okay in a system that values individual liberty and autonomy.
So how does Rothbard propose we deal with aggression when it does occur? What's his approach to punishment?
This is where things get really interesting. Unlike many people who focus on things like deterrence or rehabilitation, Rothbard's primary concern is justice. He advocates for what he calls proportional punishment, which is all about making the victim whole again.
Proportional punishment. Okay, so walk me through that. How does that work in practice?
It means that the punishment should fit the crime, not in terms of severity, but in terms of the rights that were violated. The criminal should have to give up rights equivalent to the rights they violated. So if someone steals a car, they don't just have to go to jail for a bit. They have to actually compensate the victim for the loss of their car.
Exactly. Plus, they might lose some of their own rights as well, like the right to own a car for a period of time. The idea is to restore a sense of balance, to make the victim whole again.
It's about making amends, righting the wrong, rather than just punishing the offender for the sake of punishment. It's about restoring what was lost as much as possible.
You got it. Rothbard believes that any punishment that goes beyond that, that's not directly tied to making the victim whole, is essentially an act of aggression by the state itself.
So it's about holding individuals accountable for their actions, for the harm they caused to others, and making sure that justice is served. But I'm already anticipating some pushback here. What about situations where it's not so easy to measure the harm caused? What about crimes that result in emotional distress or psychological trauma? How do you put a price tag on that?
Those are all valid questions, and Rothbard acknowledges that there will be complexities and gray areas in any system of justice. But he believes that starting with this principle of proportional punishment, of focusing on restitution and making the victim whole, provides a much more morally sound foundation than the often arbitrary and excessive punishments meted out by the state.
It's a different way of thinking about justice, that's for sure. And speaking of different ways of thinking about things, we can't talk about Rothbard without addressing his views on children's rights, which tend to be among his most controversial.
Definitely a hot-button issue. Rothbard really challenges us to question some deeply ingrained assumptions about the nature of parental authority and the role of the state in family life.
And he does this by asking a very direct, and some might say uncomfortable question. To what extent do parents own their children?
That's right. He's directly challenging the idea that parents have an inherent and unlimited right to dictate every aspect of their children's lives just because they are their parents. He's asking us to consider where parental rights end and children's rights begin.
It's a conversation that often generates more heat than light, but it's an important one to have nonetheless. And Rothbard doesn't shy away from courting controversy, especially when he lays out his views on parental obligations. For example, he argues that parents shouldn't be legally obligated to keep their children alive if they don't want to.
That's definitely one of his most provocative statements, and it's important to understand the reasoning behind it. He's not advocating for child neglect or abuse. In fact, he condemns those things as strongly as anyone. What he's questioning is the state's role in enforcing parental obligations, which he sees as a slippery slope that could lead to even greater intrusions on individual liberty.
So he's not saying that parents should neglect their children, but rather that it shouldn't be the state's role to force them to care for their children if they choose not to. He's really emphasizing parental autonomy, even when it clashes with what many would consider the best interests of the child.
Exactly. He's concerned that giving the state that kind of power over family life could have dangerous consequences down the line. He sees it as a potential threat to individual liberty and parental rights.
It's a classic slippery slope argument. If we allow the state to dictate this, what's to stop them from dictating other aspects of our lives, our families, our choices?
And you can see how this connects back to his overall emphasis on individual liberty and limited government. He's consistent in his application of these principles, even when it leads him to conclusions that many find difficult to swallow.
He certainly makes you think, that's for sure. And speaking of thought-provoking, let's move on to another area where Rothbard's views often spark debate: his perspective on freedom of speech. This is a topic that's always relevant, and Rothbard's take on it is both consistent with his overall philosophy and surprisingly nuanced at the same time.
It's a great example of how Rothbard applies his principles of self-ownership and property rights to a very specific issue. He doesn't see freedom of speech as some kind of special right that exists independently of other rights. Instead, he grounds it firmly in his broader theory of property rights.
Okay, so how does he make that connection? How does freedom of speech relate to property rights in Rothbard's view?
Well, remember how we were talking about how your labor and your creations are extensions of yourself and therefore deserve protection as property? Rothbard argues that your voice, your ideas, your expressions, those are all products of your mind, of your individuality, just as much as any physical creation.
So your words are your property because they originate from you, from your unique perspective and experiences.
Exactly. So in Rothbard's view, freedom of speech isn't some gift from the government. It's a natural right that flows from your ownership of yourself and your right to express your thoughts and ideas without censorship.
That makes sense. But what about all those classic free speech dilemmas, like the whole shouting fire in a crowded theater scenario? Does Rothbard's theory hold up in those situations?
That's where the nuance comes in. Even though he grounds free speech in property rights, he doesn't believe that you can say anything, anytime, anywhere without consequences.
Your right to swing your fist ends where someone else's nose begins, right?
Exactly. And that's where property rights come into play again.
So if I own a theater, I have the right to set rules for what people can and cannot do on my property. And that includes prohibiting behavior that could incite panic or endanger others.
Precisely. It's about balancing individual rights with the responsibility that comes with those rights. Your right to free speech doesn't give you the right to infringe on someone else's property rights or to cause harm to others.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about more subtle forms of speech, like libel or slander? How does Rothbard's theory apply to situations where someone's words might damage another person's reputation, but not necessarily cause them direct physical harm?
That's a great question. It gets to how Rothbard distinguishes between legitimate expressions of free speech and actions that cross the line into aggression. He argues that you have a right to express your opinions, even if they're negative, unpopular, or even false, as long as you're not directly and intentionally causing harm to someone else's person or property.
So I can criticize your taste in music all day long, but I can't spread lies about you that could cost you your job or ruin your relationships.
Exactly. It's about drawing a clear line between expressing opinions, even if they're unpopular or offensive to some, and engaging in actions that directly violate someone else's rights. And for Rothbard, that line is crossed when your words are used as a weapon to inflict tangible harm on another person.
So it's about finding that balance between protecting individual liberty and ensuring that freedom isn't used to justify harming others. It's about respecting individual rights while also acknowledging that those rights come with certain responsibilities.
You got it. And this constant tension between rights and responsibilities is really at the heart of Rothbard's approach to freedom of speech. He wants to create a system where ideas can be freely exchanged and debated, but he also recognizes that we need some safeguards against those who would abuse that freedom to harm others.
It's a tricky balance to strike, and there's definitely room for debate about where exactly that line should be drawn. But I think Rothbard's framework, grounding free speech and property rights and emphasizing individual responsibility, offers a valuable starting point for those discussions.
Absolutely. He gives us a way to think about free speech that goes beyond just shouting slogans about free speech absolutism. It's about acknowledging the complexities, the nuances, and the responsibilities that come with this fundamental right. And it's this willingness to grapple with complexity, to challenge conventional thinking, that makes Rothbard's work so relevant even today.
He really challenges us to rethink some of our most basic assumptions about how society should work. He doesn't shy away from asking the tough questions, and he's always pushing us to think more deeply about the relationship between individual liberty and the role of the state. And speaking of the state, we can't talk about Rothbard without addressing his very, shall we say, critical perspective on the role of government.
To put it mildly, Rothbard is about as anti-state as it gets. He sees the state as inherently coercive, a fundamental violation of individual liberty.
He doesn't mince words, does he?
Not when it comes to this topic. He views taxation as theft, plain and simple. He sees war as a massive violation of individual rights, and he's extremely critical of any attempt by the state to suppress dissent, even in the name of national security.
So it's safe to say he's not a fan of big government programs and policies.
You could say that again. He sees those things as infringements on individual liberty, as the state overstepping its bounds and encroaching on the rights of individuals.
But his critique of the state goes beyond just disagreeing with specific policies. He seems to reject the very idea of the state as a legitimate institution.
Exactly. Rothbard argues that the state is inherently illegitimate because it ultimately derives its power through coercion, not consent.
So even if a government is democratically elected, he would still argue that it's illegitimate because it has the power to force its citizens to obey its laws.
Precisely. He argues that the social contract, this idea that we've all consented to be governed, is largely a fiction. In reality, he says, most people never explicitly agreed to be governed, and even if they did, they rarely have a real choice in the matter.
It's a pretty radical stance to take. So if he's so against the state, what's the alternative? What's his vision for a society without a state?
That's where things get really interesting. Rothbard embraces the term anarchy, but not in the sense of chaos and disorder that most people associate with that word.
So not Mad Max, but more like a society where people voluntarily cooperate and find peaceful solutions to their differences.
Exactly. Rothbard believes that without the state, individuals and private organizations would step up to provide security, resolve disputes, and create a system of justice based on those principles we were talking about earlier: voluntary agreements, restitution, making the victim whole.
It's a vision that requires a lot of faith in human nature and our ability to cooperate and create order without a central authority calling the shots. But I can see how it aligns with his whole emphasis on individual liberty and responsibility. If you truly believe that people are capable of managing their own affairs without the interference of the state, then I guess anarchy starts to look less like chaos and more like the logical conclusion of that belief system.
And Rothbard would argue it's not just a matter of belief. He points to historical examples of societies that function pretty well without a centralized state, and also to all the countless examples we see today of private individuals and organizations successfully providing services that most people assume only the government can handle.
It's about shifting our perspective, looking for those alternative models, imagining a world where power is more spread out, people have more control over their own lives, and the government isn't the default answer to every problem. Those are all interesting ideas, but those are just theories. How did Rothbard envision this kind of radical change actually happening? Did he advocate for like a violent overthrow of the state or something?
Actually, no. When it came to actually creating change, Rothbard was surprisingly pragmatic. He didn't believe in violent revolution or a sudden collapse of the state. He thought it was much more important to focus on education, on spreading libertarian ideas, and on engaging in peaceful activism to challenge the status quo and nudge society in a more libertarian direction.
So it's more about a gradual shift in consciousness than a sudden seizure of power. It's about winning hearts and minds, not waging wars.
Exactly. He believed that by showing people the benefits of individual liberty, by pointing out the problems and injustices that often come with state power, and by offering practical alternatives, it would be possible to slowly chip away at the state's authority and build a freer, more just society over time.
It's a hopeful vision, but I imagine it takes a lot of patience. It's not a quick fix, that's for sure. But I do find something inspiring about Rothbard's unwavering belief in the power of ideas to change the world. It reminds me that even the most deeply entrenched systems can change if enough people start to question them and imagine something better.
I agree. And while we might not agree with all of his conclusions, I think there's a lot we can learn from Rothbard's approach to thinking about these issues. He was fearless in his commitment to questioning assumptions, to challenging conventional wisdom, and to really pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable thought. I think that's something we could all use a little more of these days.
I think you're right. Rothbard's work is a good reminder that there are always alternative ways of seeing the world, of organizing society. and that we shouldn't be afraid to question the way things are just because that's the way they've always been.
Absolutely. And sometimes asking those difficult questions, even if they make us uncomfortable, can lead us to new insights and a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Well said. And on that note, as we wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating, frustrating, and always thought-provoking world of Murray Rothbard, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to chew on. If, as Rothbard argues, all physical aggression is a violation of property rights, how do we approach something like pollution, where one person's actions, even if they're unintentional, can directly impact the health and property of others?
That's a tough one. It gets to the heart of those tricky questions about balancing individual liberty with the common good. And it's something that libertarians and non-libertarians are still debating today. There's no easy answers, but I think grappling with those kinds of complex questions is essential if we want to create a society that truly respects individual rights while also addressing those broader social concerns.
Well said. It's all about finding that balance, right? And that's a good place to leave it for today. We hope you found this deep dive into the work of Murray Rothbard to be thought-provoking, maybe even a little bit mind-bending. It's certainly given us all a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep those minds open and keep asking those tough questions.